Assembly. One more moment. I'm going to call the Assembly Lands, Housing and Economic Development Committee to order for July 17th. It's 5 o'clock. Ms. Cole, would you read the land acknowledgement, please?
Thank you. We would like to acknowledge the city and borough of Juneau is on Tlingit land and wish to honor the indigenous people of this land. For more than 10,000 years, Alaska Native people have been and continue to be integral to the well-being of our community. We're grateful to be in this place, a part of this community, and to honor the culture, traditions, and resilience of the Tlingit people. Gudashish.
Thank you, Ms. Cole. Ms. Duckworth, would you call the roll, please?
Assemblymember Wall.
Present.
Assemblymember Wahi-Gadag. Chair Bryson.
Present.
And Assemblymember Hughes Gandius is not with us, and Mandy Cole from Planning Commission is here. And we also have Mayor Beth Weldon attending.
Thank you. We have a quorum. Are there any requests for agenda changes? Seeing none, that agenda is moved. Approval of the minutes. Are there any requests for minute changes? I did not see any. We will consider those, no objections. We'll consider those minutes approved. Agenda topics. Mr. Blydorn, agenda topic 2.
Thank you, Chair Bryson. So the first topic of this evening is the 2023 foreclosure property disposal. So in your packet, you've received a memo with a suggested recommendation for a motion and a bunch of photos of the property that's located at 526th Street, and that's the one that has the structure on it. And so at this point in time, staff are looking for some direction from the committee to move these forward through disposal. We've had conversations internally with city staff and other departments to ensure that there is no public need to retain these. And so at this point in time, we're looking for a motion from the committee to direct the city attorney to draft and introduce ordinances that authorize the disposal of these properties because of delinquent property tax. And I'll gladly answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Blydorn. Questions from the committee? Seeing no questions, Ms. Wohl, could you do a motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move the Lands, Housing and Economic Development Committee direct the attorney to draft and introduce an ordinance that authorizes the disposal of these properties. And I ask for unanimous consent.
Thank you, Ms. Wall. You've heard the motion. Are there any objections? Wahi-Gadag, were you trying to get in?
No, sir.
All right. Seeing no objections, that motion passes.
And I'll just add a point of clarification there. I believe these will be independent ordinances for each property. And so just to clarify, there'll be an ordinance per property. So 2 ordinances.
Ms. Wool, was that the intent of your motion, ma'am?
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much. That was the intent of the motion. So 2 motions to move forward with that. All right, moving on, agenda topic 3, Southeast Alaska Food Bank request for gravel at less than fair market value. Mr. Blydorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so a little background on this one, I have a memo in the packet and I included their recommended or their request as well. And so the food bank is located at the end of Crazy Horse Drive and it sits on city property. They have a 30-year lease and it's come up a few times in the past few years because they started out, I believe, with a 1/4 acre. And then they needed more space for parking and then they continued to grow their facility a little bit. So now they're working on their next level of expansion to continue to meet the region's needs. And this included earlier this year coming through and requesting additional space. And so they're building a new warehouse for food. And part of this site here is so challenging because of the wetlands. And so basically what they're asking for, what their request is access to the Lemon Creek material source that the city owns. And so at this point in time, staff are looking for direction from this committee in the form of a motion, and staff requests that the committee provide a motion of support for the city manager to work with the Southeast Alaska Food Bank to grant access to the city gravel resource at the cost of $4.90 a ton. And that value, they originally requested this at no cost, but the way the gravel pits work is they're basically just used for city and state projects through the CIP process. And if we were to give gravel away for free, for example, those costs would be passed on to all the other CIP projects. So this $4.90 a ton, which the food bank has agreed to, is meant to cover our costs. And if you've read my memo on the last page of the packet, gravel pits got funded through the CIP process this year, and there is heavy expense coming for them. And so with that, I'll answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Blydorn.
I
Go
know
ahead,
that we
Mr.
do
Blydorn.
have a representative from the food bank on Zoom, so if there's questions, we can bring them on board too.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Blydorn. Questions from the committee about the Southeast Food Bank gravel purchase? Seeing no questions, could I get a motion? Well, Hall Gadak, please.
Sure, I move in support for the city manager to work with Southeast Alaska Food Bank to grant access to city gravel resources at the cost of $4.90 a ton.
And ask for unanimous consent.
Yeah, that too.
All right. You've heard the motion. Are there any objections? Seeing none, that is so approved. Thank you. All right. Agenda topic 4, ordinance amending the sensitive area requirements of the land use code related to landslides and avalanches. Mr. Blydorn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have Director McLean coming up to talk on this topic. And I'll note that we also have the city attorney with us online as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe the city manager is also going to be joining us as well. But while we may wait for him, I just want to take the opportunity. There he is. Just to clarify for the record, we've had a couple of comments, or at least one from the public, about the notice of recommendation from the Planning Commission. There was a revised notice of recommendation issued. It was dated June 27th, 2023. And I think what has happened is that because this has kind of bounced back and forth between the commission and the assembly levels, that it's in a packet, but it may not have made your packet tonight. So we will make certain that if it stays here, it gets in your next one, or if it moves on to the committee of the whole, that it'll also be included in that one as well, to make sure that you all have it readily available. And if you wouldn't mind, I would just take a moment to read that. So the hearing date was May 23rd, 2023. The Planning Commission at its regular public meeting amended the analysis and findings listed in the attached memorandum dated May 8th, 2023, and recommended the following to the City and Borough Assembly. Do not adopt the director's analysis and findings, and do not adopt the proposed ordinance amending the code related to landslide and avalanche areas, and do not adopt the landslide and avalanche area maps. Consider a method of public notification based on the 1987 adopted hazard maps for affected property owners. That was the fix. In the original NOR, I had made a mistake and it said the Tetra Tech maps. So just to be clear, their recommendation was referencing the 87 adopted hazard maps. Thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions, and I think the city manager as well, but I think the discussion maybe starts with all of you first and what we can do to help you through this.
Thank you, Director McLean. So that I'm clear, the Planning Commission's recommendation is to leave things as is with the 1987 adopted maps. So the recommendation from the Planning Commission is as business as usual.
That is correct, Mr. Chair, with the one addition of considering a method of public notification.
Questions from the committee? Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I went back and listened to the Planning Commission meeting, which was really helpful to hear the public comment and kind of the commissioner's discussion. One thing, that is weighing on me, I think, is, this, I guess I'm not quite sure that, the public is, the larger public has enough awareness of kind of the risks of some of these hazards. And so kind of the idea of providing more information to the community, strikes me as a good thing. Can you talk about the difference between what we know about these maps existing versus releasing them as public information versus adopting them, and what the difference is between those options in terms of potential impacts, both positive and negative?
Thank you, Ms. Wall. Who has this one, Mr. Watt or Director McLean?
Mr. Chair, I think it would be useful if the city attorney, Ms. Lane, could kind of start us off on what the obligations are or are not, and go from there.
Excellent. Ms. Lane, are you with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Loud and clear. Did you hear Director McLean's request?
Okay, so I was getting brought over, and so I just missed a big chunk. If the question could be repeated.
Director McLean had requested that you give us our legal requirements for that. Go ahead and say it again, Director McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Lane, we were speaking to sort of what are CBJ's obligations if we adopt the map or don't adopt the new Tetra Tech maps, and if we only put them out for public information versus adoption.
Thank you. And so I don't know if everyone read the memo that was included in the packet, but there is a 2-page memo that actually gives a good summary of that. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. I think it's in the packet. And for the most part, there's the CBJ as a regulator. So there are categories that indicate CBJ is not liable for adopting them or not adopting them, essentially. So it's really up to the assembly what they want to do. The CBJ is not going to be liable for money damages, whether we adopt them or not adopt them. There's some regulatory taking arguments that are fact specific. And then there are Tetra Tech limitations with the map that are included that Tetra Tech puts in there. So it's, Alaska law provides a lot of immunity to the CBJ. So it's really a matter of what the assembly wants to do. Adopt them or not adopt them. There's not going to be a lot of liability associated with that piece of it. So that's probably not like super helpful, but it's a policy call at this point. And you can refer to that memo, or I can provide more information if you have specific questions.
Thank you, Ms. Lane. All right, Ms. Wall, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I wasn't quite, maybe I can ask my question a different way. This question really isn't for Ms. Lane. I understand what our legal obligations are. I'm thinking more about kind of the other impacts that the difference between public information versus adoption versus just these reports existing out there because they've been published. What are the impacts of that? We've heard from folks that they're worried about not being able to sell their house. Does it matter if we release these as public information versus adoption? Does one give more credence to one of those versus the other? So I think this is less of a legal question.
Thank you, Ms. Wall. I kind of had the same question. Does adoption prevent those?
I think I'll start, Mr. Chair, and then maybe Mr. Manager fill me in if I miss anything or anything else I haven't thought of. Immediately, though, what comes to mind for me, and I hope this is a good comparison, maybe for the assembly members, may not be so much for the public, but when I look at adoption versus public information, as Ms. Wool was speaking, it sort of came to mind ordinance versus resolution, right? Ordinance applies to everybody, public or private, CBJ or private resident, property owner. Whereas a resolution, typically, it's something we take the burden on a CBJ. But it doesn't necessarily apply, and I'm speaking very generally, doesn't necessarily apply to private property owners. So when I think about adoption of these maps versus just making them available for public information, I think the one distinction is that if they are adopted and then CBJ also wants to adopt code or ordinance regulations for it, those will have to be abided by, we'll have to interpret them, apply them, the usual, what we do today. Whereas if they're only adopted as informational pieces, then we could, and I've mentioned this a few times, so maybe now it's a good time to mention it, along with part of what the commission recommended was public notification. So adopt the maps as information, or not even adopt the maps, sorry. The maps are just out there for informational purposes only in this scenario. Once a year, say in September, before the hazard seasons kind of pick up for the most part, we could issue what I would imagine a pamphlet, borough-wide, all property owners. Do you know where you live? Do you know we have hazards? We have avalanche, we have landslide, we have flood, pretty much have it all here, more or less in some way. So all our properties are impacted a little bit, somewhat. So I think it would behoove us to at least put that information out to the public. But I think that's really it. If they're informational, I don't have to apply code. I don't have to regulate them. And people, you would just go through permitting as you would if you weren't in a hazard zone. And then, yeah, and I think that sums it up.
Mr. Watt.
Thank you, Chair. I think really for the assembly, the question is kind of revolves around how much weight do you want to put on them and how easy do you want to make it for the public to know and understand that the study and maps exist. Municipality from time to time adopts all sorts of plans and studies, and I can think of, a while back we had the Willoughby District Plan, and the assembly liked a portion, so we adopted a chapter of that plan, but the rest of it was just kind of informational. I think you have a lot of discretion here. If there is some formal adoption, I think the public will perceive that the city is receiving and at least on some level endorsing the ideas and conclusions. If there's some kind of adoption, a party that is not engaged today is more likely to be able to learn that the information exists than if we just receive it and just have it on the shelf. I think there's kind of a sliding scale, and those two concepts to me, I think, are most important. How much weight of importance do you want to put behind receiving, adopting, whatever, and how easy do you want to make it for the public to know and understand that this study and maps were done and created?
Thank you, Mr. Watt. Ms. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Planning Commission did consider this question, which is why the recommendation specifically says, and please do not adopt the maps. And the reason we ended up going with that kind of strong affirmative language was because we were swayed by the informed public testimony that said adoption of the maps, whether or not you regulate, and lends credence to them in such a way as to, it doesn't really matter about the regulatory part of it. An insurer or a mortgage agent is going to see the maps as adopted by the CBJ, believe that they are endorsed as an adoption would be, it would be fair to interpret an adoption as an endorsement. And then those problems that we were talking about before cascade from that. And so the Planning Commission chose to say, do not adopt the maps. We talked a little bit that was a big step for us, I think. And we talked a little bit about further recommending to review and or strike the 87 maps as well. We didn't get there in terms of the recommendation, but we certainly did talk about that. And I know that that was part of on the mind of some commissioners. So that essentially the regulation of landslides and avalanches would no longer be, and maps would not be purview of the city.
Thank you, Ms. Cole. That actually would be my next question. How would we, what would be the consequences of eliminating the hazard maps, the 87 adopted hazard maps, and then letting the burden just be on the homeowner and not have the city? As I was reading through this, it made it look like that we could remove those regulations and then let the homeowner be responsible for what they build on their home. Is that the same understanding that you guys have after reading all this?
That's correct, Mr. Chair. If the assembly were to repeal the maps and repeal the ordinance, then these areas would be treated the same as any other zoning district that they're in.
Excellent. Thank you, Director McLean. Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to keep pulling on that thread a little bit. So if we don't pass the ordinance, there's no building restrictions there other than zoning. And so the planning commission wouldn't say, oh, you're in an avalanche zone. They would just do complete what's correct for that zoning. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Somewhat, but I think I heard you, I'm not sure I heard you say that you would have to repeal, you would first have to repeal the adopted maps, repeal the adopted code, and then it would be treated just like any other area. Now, I will say within the same section of chapter, but a separate section is hillside endorsements. So anywhere across the borough, if you impact something like 18, if you have a slope of 18% and you're impacting it, that applies to everybody. Doesn't matter if you're in a hazard zone or not, just has to do with the slope. So there are different pieces, but those would still apply as they do today. So you'd repeal both and they would be treated equal to the other applicants.
Follow up, Madam Mayor.
So looking at the only difference that I see is looking at options is number 5, which does that. And the only difference is, and then we would notify the public every year that you are potentially in a moderate or high hazard area. Which to me, I guess if they sold the property, it would be concerning, but I'm with Mr. Bryson on this. I think if it's your property, you can do what you want. However, I am concerned of people renting, not knowing what's going on. So I could see that.
Director McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have anything to add other than I would frankly expand the notification though. So it isn't just avalanche and landslide, but it is flood as well, simply because I don't think a lot of people realize necessarily the impacts if you haven't been here that long. And they may not know where they live, and the same with renters too. If they're moving around, those may be new hazards for them that they weren't aware of before.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, Director McLean. I want to make a comment and then I'll go for a motion here. My brother lives on the other side of the continent, North Carolina, the Kill Devil Hills archipelago. It's a little landlocked kind of little island, almost the same size as Juneau, but they have a bridge that connects them to the mainland. It's a little different. But they can't build a house. You can't build any house on the ground. Your house has to be on stilts, a minimum of like 8 to 10 feet up, because they know that eventually the ocean's going to come and kiss your house. And so they just let the rules work with the mother nature that they have. And if we remove this slide and avalanche hazard, now we're getting the government out of telling people what they can do on their property. And then we're allowing people to develop the property the way they want to in the area they want to. Nobody builds a house on the side of a hill and says, that angle's not going to matter. They're going to look at this stuff. So I think that the once a year reminding everybody where you at, what are your hazards, that's adequate for the people that choose to live in this area or choose to develop in this area. That's all I'm going to say about it. I can see how we can correct this. Well, Hagaduck, would you like to give a shot at a motion here?
I can try.
Ms. Wool, did you have one?
I think I do, but I'm not sure where we're, I'm happy to see what, if Lahagadak has an idea. If not, I can try something. I'm not. My recommendation would be to narrow these options down, because I'm not sure the three of us are gonna agree on what options are in front of us.
Which options do you like, Ms. Wall?
Well, I'll tell you which ones I don't like. And I may add one to the list. So what I was going to remove from the options here. Well, first, I will say that the option that I think, correct me if I'm wrong, there is no option here that is don't adopt maps, don't adopt new ordinances, and repeal old map and old ordinances. I'm not suggesting that, but it seems like that should be one of our options. It doesn't seem to me like we should maintain the status quo and keep, if we're not going to adopt new maps and we're not going to adopt new ordinances, I don't believe that we should keep the old maps and the old ordinances because they're wrong and they're causing problems. And so I would remove option 1 and option 2, and I would add another option that would basically repeal repeal everything and then keep option 3, 4, and 5 on the table for discussion for the full assembly. And that was probably way confusing, but I'll stop.
Option 3, option 4. Well, Hagadak, did you want to put 2 cents into the options that might be moving forward, ma'am?
No, I actually appreciate the the way that you phrased that, Ms. Wall, because it feels like by adding in that what would be option 6 kind of gives us that really good balance of what we could discuss at the full assembly. I think during our last meeting, we definitely discussed that this should be a full assembly discussion and not just lands. And I appreciate just moving forward with like, these are the options that are on the table to the full assembly rather than making one specific recommendation that we were in favor of this option over that one.
Helpful. Madam Mayor.
Thank you. And I'm not going to vote on these, but Ms. Wall, I don't see the difference between your option and option 5 because it does repeal the current maps and current ordinance. So could you explain that to me, what you see as your difference?
My understanding is that option 5 does include adopting things for public information. And although I'm not sure, I'm not saying my opinion, but I feel like there are people out there who don't even want these things out there for public information. And so I don't share that opinion, but I was going to leave that option on the table if there were others who felt like we don't put out this information for the public. Does that make sense, Madam Mayor?
Madam Mayor.
Yes, it does. My follow-up question would be, and it wouldn't be for you, is if we don't adopt them for public information, how do we share this information with the public? Because it's obviously a study that we paid for, but we can talk about that at the committee of the whole just fine.
Very good. Ms. Cole, did you have another question? So Ms. Wall, as I understand, your motion would be to move forward option 3, option 4, and option 6 that would remove all and reject the maps. Is that? Or you were clarifying that your option 5 and option 6 were close enough?
I'm open to the will of the body on that one. I think it would be easier for the discussion to have four options for the full assembly. Option 2, option 3, so no, repeat, sorry, option 3, option 4, option 5, and a sixth option, which is do nothing with the new maps, do nothing with the new ordinances, and repeal the old maps and the old ordinances. And I'm not saying that's my opinion, but I think that is a option that the assembly should consider given what the planning commission heard and what we've heard from the public.
Ms. Wool, can we take that simplified as your motion? 2,
Yes.
3, 4, or 3, 4, 5, and 6. We're at 3,
Yes.
4, 5, and 6.
Yes.
The top half of the dice. Okay, 3, 4, 5, and 6. You've heard Ms. Wool's motion to advance option 3, 4, 5, and 6 to the committee of the whole. Are there any objections? Seeing none, that is so moved. All right, staff reports.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so I just put together a staff report with a number of projects that staff have been working on. I'll note that the first paragraph under Telephone Hill, I accidentally in the first sentence referenced Peterson Hill, which should have been Telephone Hill. So if you caught that. And then so basically I wanted to provide this information to the committee because the last few verbal updates we didn't have time for. And so you have this information in front of you. And if you have questions on any of these topics, I'd be glad to answer them.
If anyone have a question for Mr. Blydorn? Mr. Blydorn, could you give an estimate on when you think the very first home might be built in any of the Peterson Hill areas?
That's a great question. We're still working on the purchase and sales agreement for that. So the fine details are still in the works, but I would say, given the current agreement, we would expect to have, I believe, 15 houses in 5 years. And so granted, the construction for those houses can't begin until the roads and utilities and sidewalks and everything is built. But the way the current purchase and sales agreement, I believe it's at 5 years for 15 units on the first phase, which is phase 1B.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Blydorn. Any additional questions? Seeing none, thank you for that report. Any other questions or comments for the good of the order? The next meeting for LHED will be August 7th. We are adjourned. Thank you.